Chapter the 6th, Oliver being goaded by the taunts of Noah rouses into action, and rather astonishes him. It was a nice sickly season just at this time. In commercial phrase, coffins were looking up, and in the course of a few weeks Oliver had acquired a great deal of experience. The success of Mr. Sowerberry's ingenious speculation exceeded even his most sanguine hopes. The oldest inhabitants recollected no period at which measles had been so prevalent, or so fatal to infant existence, and many were the mournful processions which little Oliver headed, in a hatband reaching down to his knees, to the indescribable admiration and emotion of all the mothers in the town. As Oliver accompanied his master in most of his adult expeditions, too, in order that he might acquire that equanimity of demeanor and full command of nerve which are so essential to a finished undertaker, he had many opportunities of observing the beautiful resignation and fortitude with which some strong-minded people bear their trials and losses. For instance, when Sowerberry had an order for the burial of some rich old lady or gentleman, who was surrounded by a great number of nephews and nieces, who had been perfectly inconsolable during the previous illness, and whose grief had been wholly irrepressible even to the most public occasions, they would be as happy among themselves as need be, quite cheerful and contented, conversing together with as much freedom and gaiety as if nothing whatever had happened to disturb them. Husbands, too, bore the loss of their wives with the most heroic calmness, and wives, again, put on the weeds for their husbands, as if, so far from grieving in the garb of sorrow, they had made up their minds to render it as becoming and attractive as possible. It was observable, too, that ladies and gentlemen who were in passions of anguish during the ceremony of interment recovered almost as soon as they reached home, and became quite composed. Before the tea-drinking was over, all this was very pleasant and improving to see, and Oliver beheld it with great admiration. That Oliver Twist was moved to resignation by the example of these good people, I cannot, although I am his biographer, undertake to affirm with any degree of confidence, but I can most distinctly say that for some weeks he continued meekly to submit to the domination and ill-treatment of Noah Claypool, who used him far worse than ever, now that his jealousy was roused by seeing the new boy promoted to the black stick and hat band, while he, the old one, remained stationary in the muffin cap and leathers. Charlotte treated him badly because Noah did, and Mrs. Sowerberry was his decided enemy because Mr. Sowerberry was disposed to be his friend. So, between these three on one side, and a glut of funerals on the other, Oliver was not altogether as comfortable as the hungry pig was when he was shut up by mistake in the grain department of a brewery. And now I come to a very important passage in Oliver's history, for I have to record an act, slight and unimportant, perhaps, in appearance, but which indirectly produced a most material change in all his future prospects and proceedings. Thank you, Dickens. I'll take it from there. This is going to be several chapters. It's going to be a long one. One day, Oliver and Noah had descended into the kitchen at the usual dinner hour to banquet upon a small joint of mutton, 1.5 pounds of the worst end of the neck, when Charlotte, being called out of the way, there ensured a brief interval of time, which Noah Claypool, being hungry and vicious, considered he could not possibly devote to a worthier purpose than aggravating and tantalizing young Oliver Twist. Intent upon this innocent amusement, Noah put his feet on the tablecloth, and pulled Oliver's hair, and twitched his ears, and expressed his opinion that he was a sneak, and furthermore announced his intention of coming to see him hung whenever that desirable event should take place, and entered upon various other topics of petty annoyance, like a malicious and ill-conditioned charity boy as he was. But none of these taunts producing the desired effect of making Oliver cry, Noah attempted to be more facetious still, and in this attempt did what many small wits, with far greater reputation than Noah notwithstanding, do to this day when they want to be funny. He got rather personal. Workhouse, said Noah. How's your mother? She's dead, replied Oliver. Don't you say anything about her to me. Oliver's color rose as he said this. He breathed quickly, and there was a curious working of the mouth and nostrils, which Mr. Claypool thought must be the immediate precursor of a violent fit of crying. Under this impression he returned to the charge. What did she die of, Workhouse? Said Noah. Of a broken heart. Some of our old nurses told me, replied Oliver, more as if he was talking to himself than answering Noah. I think I know what it must be to die of that. Tol de ro lo lo, right fol le re, Workhouse, said Noah, as a tear rolled down Oliver's cheek. What set you a-snivelling now? Not you, replied Oliver, hastily brushing the tear away. Don't think it. Oh, not me, eh? Sneered Noah. No, not you, replied Oliver sharply. There, that's enough. Don't say anything more to me about her. You better not. Better not, exclaimed Noah. Well, better not. Workhouse, don't be impudent. Your mother, too. She was a nice one, she was. Oh, Lord. And here Noah nodded his head expressively, and curled up as much of his small red nose as muscular action could collect together for the occasion. You know, Workhouse, continued Noah, emboldened by Oliver's silence, and speaking in a jeering tone of affected pity. Of all tones, the most annoying. You know, Workhouse, it can't be helped now, and of course you couldn't help it then, and I'm very sorry for it, and I'm sure we all are, and pity you very much. But you must know, Workhouse, your mother was a regular right-down bad un. What did you say? Inquired Oliver, looking up very quickly. A regular right-down bad un, Workhouse, replied Noah coolly. And it's a great deal better, Workhouse, that she died when she did, or else she'd have been hard laboring in Bridewell, or transported, or hung, which is more likely than either, isn't it? Crimson with fury, Oliver started up, overthrew chair and table, seized Noah by the throat, shook him in the violence of his rage, till his teeth chattered in his head, and collecting his whole force into one heavy blow, felled him to the ground. A minute ago, the boy had looked the quiet, mild, dejected creature that harsh treatment had made him. But his spirit was roused at last. The cruel insult to his dead mother had set his blood on fire. His breast heaved, his attitude was erect, his eyes bright and vivid, and his whole person changed as he stood glaring over the cowardly tormentor that lay crouching at his feet and defied him with an energy he had never known before. "He'll murder me!" blubbered Noah. "Charlotte! Mrs. Here's the new boy murdering me! Help! Help! Oliver's gone mad! Charlotte!" Noah's shouts were responded to by a loud scream from Charlotte and a louder from Mrs. Sowerberry, the former of whom rushed into the kitchen by a side door, while the latter paused on the staircase till she was quite certain that it was consistent with the preservation of human life to come further down. "Oh, you little wretch!" screamed Charlotte, seizing Oliver with her utmost force, which was about equal to that of a moderately strong man in particularly good training. "Oh, you little ungrateful, murderous, horrid villain!" And between every syllable, Charlotte gave Oliver a blow with all her might, and accompanied it with a scream for the benefit of society. Charlotte's fist was by no means a light one, but lest it should not be effectual in calming Oliver's wrath, Mrs. Sowerberry plunged into the kitchen and insisted to hold him with one hand while she scratched her face, with the other. And in this favorable position of affairs, Noah rose from the ground and pummeled him from behind. This was rather too violent exercise to last long, so when they were all three wearied out, and could tear and beat no longer, they dragged Oliver, struggling and shouting, but nothing daunted, into the dust cellar, and there locked him up. And this being done, Mrs. Sowerberry sunk into a chair and burst into tears. "Bless her, she's going off," said Charlotte. "A glass of water, Noah. Dear, make haste." "Oh, Charlotte," said Mrs. Sowerberry, speaking as well as she could, through a deficiency of breath and a sufficiency of cold water, which Noah had poured over her head and shoulders. "Oh, Charlotte, what a mercy we have not been all murdered in our beds!" "Oh, mercy indeed, ma'am," was the reply. "I only hope this'll teach master not to have any more of these dreadful creatures that are born to be murderers and robbers from their very cradle. Poor Noah! He was all but killed, ma'am, when I came in." "Ah, poor fellow," said Mrs. Sowerberry, looking piteously on the charity boy. Noah, whose top waistcoat button might have been somewhere on a level with the crown of Oliver's head, rubbed his eyes with the inside of his wrists while this commiseration was bestowed upon him, and performed some very audible... Oh, he was going to murder Oliver. Tears and sniffs. "What's to be done?" exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry. "Your master's not at home. There's not a man in the house, and he'll kick that door down in 10 minutes. Oliver's vigorous plunges against the bit of timber in question rendered this occurrence highly probable. "Dear, dear, I don't know, ma'am," said Charlotte, "unless we send for the police officers." "Or the military," suggested Mr. Claypool. No, said Mrs. Sowerberry, bethinking herself of Oliver's old friend. "Run to Mr. Bumble, Noah, and tell him to come here directly, and not to lose a minute. Never mind your cap. Make haste. You can hold a knife to that black eye as you run along, and it'll keep the swelling down." Noah stopped to make no reply, but started off at his fullest speed, and very much astonished the people who were out walking to see a charity boy tearing through the streets pell-mell with no cap on his head and a clasp knife at his eye. Chapter the 11th treats of Mr. Fang, the police magistrate, and furnishes a slight specimen of his mode of administering justice. The offense had been committed within the district, and indeed in the immediate neighborhood of a very notorious metropolitan police office. The crowd had only the satisfaction of accompanying Oliver through 2 or 3 streets and down a place called Mutton Hill, when he was led beneath a low archway and up a dirty court into this dispensary of summary justice by the back way. It was a small paved yard, into which they turned, and here they encountered a stout man with a bunch of whiskers on his face and a bunch of keys in his hand. "What's the matter now?" said the man carelessly. "A young fogle hunter," replied the man who had Oliver in charge. "Are you the party that's been robbed, sir?" inquired the man with the keys. "Yes, I am," replied the old gentleman, "but I'm not sure that this boy actually took the handkerchief. I'd rather not press the case." "Must go before the magistrate now, sir," replied the man. "His worship will be disengaged in half a minute. Now, young gallows." This was an invitation for Oliver to enter through a door which he unlocked as he spoke, and which led into a small stone cell. Here he was searched, and nothing being found upon him, locked up. This cell was in shape and size something like an area cellar, only not so light. It was most intolerably dirty, for it was Monday morning, and it had been tenanted since Saturday night by 6 drunken people. But this is nothing. In our station houses, men and women are every night confined on the most trivial charges, the word is worth noting, in dungeons compared with which those in Newgate, occupied by the most atrocious felons, tried, found guilty, and under sentence of death, are palaces. Let any man who doubts this compare the two. The old gentleman looked almost as rueful as Oliver when the key grated in the lock, and turned with a sigh to the book which had been the innocent cause of all this disturbance. "There is something in that boy's face," said the old gentleman to himself as he walked slowly away, tapping his chin with the cover of the book in a thoughtful manner. "Something that touches and interests me. Can he be innocent? He looked like... By the by," exclaimed the old gentleman, halting very abruptly and staring up into the sky. "God bless my soul, where have I seen something like that look before?" After musing for some minutes, the old gentleman walked with the same meditative face into a back anteroom opening from the yard, and there, retiring into a corner, called up before his mind's eye a vast amphitheater of faces, over which a dusky curtain had hung for many years. "No," said the old gentleman, shaking his head, It must be imagination. He wandered over them again. He had called them into view, and it was not easy to replace the shroud that had so long concealed them. The shroud. That thesaurus. Thesaurus. There were the faces of friends and foes, and of many that had been almost strangers peering intrusively from the crowd. There were the faces of young and blooming girls that were now old women. There were others that the grave had changed to ghastly trophies of death, but which the mind, superior to his power, still dressed in their old freshness and beauty, called back the luster of the eyes, the brightness of the smile, the beaming of the soul through its mask of clay, and whispering of beauty beyond the tomb, changed but to be heightened, and taken from earth only to be set up as a light to shed a soft and gentle glow upon the path to heaven. But the old gentleman could recall no one countenance of which Oliver's features bore a trace, so he heaved a sigh over the recollections he had awakened, and being, happily for himself, an absent old gentleman, buried them again in the pages of the musty book. He was roused by a touch on the shoulder, and a request from the man with the keys to follow him into the office. He closed his book hastily, and was at once ushered into the imposing presence of the renowned Mr. Fang. The office was a front parlor with a paneled wall. Mr. Fang sat behind a bar at the upper end, and on one side of the door was a sort of wooden pen in which poor little Oliver was already deposited, trembling very much at the awfulness of the scene. Mr. Fang was a middle-sized man, with no great quantity of hair, and what he had growing on the back and sides of his head. His face was stern, and much flushed. If he were really not in the habit of drinking rather more than was exactly good for him, he might have brought an action against his countenance for libel, and have recovered heavy damages. The old gentleman bowed respectfully, and advancing to the magistrate's desk, said, suiting the action to the word, "That is my name and address, sir." He then withdrew a pace or two, and with another polite and gentlemanly inclination of the head, waited to be questioned. Now, it so happened that Mr. Fang was at that moment perusing a leading article in a newspaper of the morning, advertising to some recent decision of his, and commending him for the 350th time to the special and particular notice of the Secretary of State for the Home Department. He was out of temper, and he looked up with an angry scowl. "Who are you?" said Mr. Fang. The old gentleman pointed with some surprise to his card. "Officer!" said Mr. Fang, tossing the card contemptuously away with the newspaper. "Who is this fellow?" "My name, sir," said the old gentleman, speaking like a gentleman, and consequently in strong contrast to Mr. Fang. "My name, sir, is Brownlow. Permit me to inquire the name of the magistrate who offers a gratuitous and unprovoked insult to a respectable man, under the protection of the bench." Saying this, Mr. Brownlow looked around the office, as if in search of some person who would afford him the required information. "Officer," said Mr. Fang, throwing the paper on one side, "what's this fellow charged with?" "He's not charged at all, your worship," replied the officer. "He appears against the boy, your worship." His worship knew this perfectly well, but it was a good annoyance and a safe one. "Appears against the boy, does he?" says Fang, surveying Mr. Brownlow contemptuously from head to foot. "Swear him." "Before I am sworn, I must beg to say one word," said Mr. Brownlow, "and that is that I never, without actual experience, could have believed—" "Hold your tongue, sir," said Mr. Fang peremptorily. "I will not, sir," replied the spirited old gentleman. "Hold your tongue this instant, or I'll have you turned out of the office," said Mr. Fang. "You're an insolent, impertinent fellow. How dare you bully a magistrate?" "What?" exclaimed the old gentleman, reddening. "Swear this person," said Fang to the clerk. I'll not hear another word. Swear him!" Mr. Brownlow's indignation was greatly roused, but reflecting that he might only injure the boy by giving vent to it, he suppressed his feelings and submitted to be sworn at once. "Now," said Feng, "what's the charge against the boy? What have you got to say, sir?" "I was standing at a bookstall," Mr. Brownlow began. "Hold your tongue, sir," said Mr. Feng. "Policeman! Where's the policeman? Here, swear this man. Now, policeman, what is this?" The policeman, with becoming humility, related how he had taken the charge, how he had searched Oliver and found nothing on his person, and how that was all he knew about it. "Are there any witnesses?" inquired Mr. Feng. "None, your worship," replied the policeman. Mr. Feng sat silent for some minutes, and then, turning round to the prosecutor, said in a towering passion, "Do you mean to state what your complaint against this boy is, fellow, or do you not? You have been sworn. Now, if you stand there refusing to give evidence, I'll punish you for disrespect to the bench. I will by what or by whom nobody knows," for the clerk and jailer coughed very loud at the right moment, and the former dropped a heavy book on the floor, thus preventing the word from being heard. Accidentally, of course. With many interruptions and repeated insults, Mr. Brownlow contrived to state his case, observing that, in the surprise of the moment, he had run after the boy because he saw him running away, and expressing his hope that, if the magistrate should believe him, although not actually the thief, to be connected with thieves, he would deal as leniently with him as justice would allow. "He has been hurt already," said the old gentleman in conclusion, "and I fear," he said with great energy, looking towards the bar, "I really fear that he is very ill." "Oh, yes, I dare say," said Mr. Feng with a sneer. "Come, none of your tricks here, you young vagabond. They won't do. What's your name?" Oliver tried to reply, but his tongue failed him. He was deadly pale, and the whole place seemed turning round and round. "What's your name, you hardened scoundrel?" thundered Mr. Feng. "Officer, what's his name?" This was addressed to a bluff old fellow in a striped waistcoat, who was standing by the bar. He bent over Oliver and repeated the inquiry, but finding him really incapable of understanding the question, and knowing that his not replying would only infuriate the magistrate the more, and add to the severity of his sentence, he hazarded a guess. "He says his name's Tom White, your worship," said this kind-hearted thief-taker. "Oh, he won't speak out, won't he?" said Feng. "Very well, very well. Where does he live?" "Where he can, your worship," replied the officer, again pretending to receive Oliver's answer. "Has he any parents?" inquired Mr. Feng. "He says they died in his infancy, your worship," replied the officer, hazarding the usual reply. At this point of the inquiry, Oliver raised his head, and looking round with imploring eyes, murmured a feeble prayer for a draught of water. "Stuff and nonsense," said Mr. Feng. "Don't try to make a fool of me." "I think he really is ill, your worship," remonstrated the officer. "I know better," said Mr. Feng. "Take care of him, officer," said the old gentleman, raising his hands instinctively. "He'll fall down." "Stand away, officer," cried Feng savagely. "Let him, if he likes." Oliver availed himself of the kind permission and fell heavily to the floor in a fainting fit. The men in the office looked at each other, but no one dared to stir. "I knew he was shamming," said Feng, as if this were incontestable proof of the fact. "Let him lie. He'll soon be tired of that." "How do you propose to deal with the case, sir?" inquired the clerk with a low voice. "Summarily," replied Mr. Feng. He stands committed for 3 months. Hard labor, of course. Clear the office. The door was opened for this purpose, and a couple of men were preparing to carry the insensible boy to his cell, when an elderly man, of decent but poor appearance, clad in an old suit of black, rushed hastily into the office, and advanced to the bench. Noah was going to kill Oliver. "Stop! Stop! Don't take him away! For heaven's sake, stop a moment!" cried the newcomer, breathless with haste. Although the presiding geniuses in such an office as this exercise a summary and arbitrary power over the liberties, the good name, the character, almost the lives of His Majesty's subjects, especially of the poorer class, and although within such walls enough fantastic tricks are daily played to make the angels weep thick tears of blood, they are closed to the public, save through the medium of the daily press. Mr. Fang was consequently not a little indignant to see an unbidden guest enter into such irreverent disorder. "What is this? Who is this? Turn this man out! Clear the office!" cried Mr. Fang. "I will speak," cried the man. "I will not be turned away. I saw it all. Keep the bookstall. I demand to be sworn. I will not be put down. Mr. Fang, you must hear me. You dare not refuse, sir." The man was right. His manner was bold, determined, and the matter was growing rather too serious to be hushed up. "Swear the fellow," growled Fang with a very ill grace. "Now, man, what have you got to say?" "This," said the man. "I saw 3 boys, 2 others, and the prisoner here, loitering on the opposite side of the way, when this gentleman was reading. The robbery was committed by another boy. I saw it done, and I saw that this boy was perfectly amazed and stupefied by it. Having by this time recovered a little breath, the whirly-twirly bookstall keeper. The worthy bookstall keeper proceeded to relate in a more coherent manner the exact circumstances of the robbery. Thesaurus. "Why didn't you come here before?" said Fang after a pause. "I hadn't a soul to mind the shop," replied the man. "Everybody that could have helped me had joined in the pursuit. I could get nobody till 5 minutes ago, and I've run here all the way." "The prosecutor was reading, was he?" inquired Fang after another pause. "Yes," replied the man. "The very book he's got in his hand." "Oh, that book, eh?" said Fang. "Is it paid for?" "No, it's not," replied the man with a smile. "Dear me, I forgot all about it," exclaimed the absent old gentleman innocently. "A nice person to prefer a charge against a poor boy," said Fang with a comical effort to look humane. "I consider, sir, that you have obtained possession of that book under very suspicious and disreputable circumstances, and you may think yourself very fortunate that the owner of the property declines to prosecute. Let this be a lesson to you, my man, or the law will overtake you yet. The boy is discharged. Clear the office." "Damn me," cried the old gentleman, bursting out with the rage he had kept down so long. "Damn me, I'll—" "Clear the office!" roared the magistrate. "Officers, do you hear? Clear the office!" The mandate was obeyed, and the indignant Mr. Brownlow was conveyed out, with the book in one hand, and a bamboo cane in the other, in a perfect frenzy of rage and defiance. He reached the yard, and it vanished in a moment. Little Oliver Twist lay on his back on the pavement, with his shirt unbuttoned and his temples bathed with water. Damn. Water. His face a deadly white, and a cold trembling convulsing his whole frame. Poor boy, said Mr. Brownlow, bending over him. Call a coach. Somebody, pray, directly. A coach was obtained, and Oliver, having been carefully laid on one seat, the old gentleman got in and sat himself on the other. "May I accompany you?" said the bookstall keeper, looking in. "Bless me, yes, my dear friend," said Mr. Brownlow quickly. "I forgot you. Dear, I've got this unhappy book still." "Jump in. Poor fellow. There's no time to lose." The bookstall keeper got into the coach and got away. They drove. Whew. Chapter 13, Chapter 14, Chapter 15. When the Dodger and his accomplished friend Master Bates joined in the hue and cry which was raised at Oliver's heels in consequence of their executing an illegal conveyance of Mr. Brownlow's personal property, as hath been already described with great perspicuity in a foregoing chapter, they were actuated, as we therein took occasion to observe, by a very laudable and becoming regard for themselves, and forasmuch as the freedom of the subject and the liberty of the individual are among the first and proudest boasts of a true-hearted Englishman, so I need hardly beg the reader to observe that this action must tend to exalt them in the opinion of all public and patriotic men, in almost as great a degree as this strong proof of their anxiety for their own preservation and safety goes to corroborate and confirm the little code of laws which certain profound and sound judging philosophers have laid down at the mainsprings of all Madam Nature's deeds and actions, the said philosophers very wisely reducing the good lady's proceedings to matters of maxims and theory, and, by a very neat and pretty compliment to her exalted wisdom and understanding, putting entirely out of sight any considerations of heart or generous impulse and feeling, as matters totally beneath a female who is acknowledged by universal admission to be so far beyond the numerous little foibles and weaknesses of her sex. If I wanted any further proof of the strictly philosophical nature of the conduct of these young gentlemen in their very delicate predicament, I should at once find it in the fact, also recorded in a foregoing part of this narrative, of their quitting the pursuit when the general attention was fixed upon Oliver, and making immediately for their home by the shortest possible cut. For although I do not mean to answer that it is the practice of renowned and learned sages at all to shorten the road to any great conclusion, their course indeed being rather to lengthen the distance by various circumlocutions and discursive staggerings, like those in which drunken men, under the pressure of a too mighty flow of ideas, are prone to indulge. Still, I do mean to say, and do say distinctly, that it is the invariable practice of all mighty philosophers, in carrying out their theories, this is important, to evince great wisdom and foresight in providing against every possible contingency which can be supposed at all likely to affect themselves. Thus, to do a great right, you may do a little wrong, and you may take any means which the end to be attained will justify. The amount of the right or the amount of the wrong, or indeed the distinction between the two, being left entirely to the philosopher concerned, to be settled and determined by his clear, comprehensive, and impartial view of his own particular case. Uh-oh. It was not until the two boys had... It was not until the two boys had scoured with great rapidity through a most intricate maze of narrow streets and courts that they ventured to halt by common consent beneath a low and dark archway. Having remained silent here just long enough to recover breath to speak. Master Bates uttered an exclamation of amusement and delight, and bursting into an uncontrollable fit of laughter, flung himself upon a doorstep, and rolled thereon in a transport of mirth. "What's the matter?" inquired the Dodger. Roared Charlie Bates. "Hold your noise," remonstrated the Dodger, looking cautiously round. "Do you want to be grabbed, stupid?" "I can't help it," said Charlie. "I can't help it. To see him splitting away at that pace, and cutting round the corners and knocking up against the posts and starting on again, as if he was made of iron as well as them, and me with a wipe in my pocket, singing out after him, oh my eye!" The vivid imagination of Master Bates presented the scene before him in two strong colors. As he arrived at this apostrophe, he again rolled upon the doorstep and laughed louder than before. "What'll Fagin say?" inquired the Dodger, taking advantage of the next interval of breathlessness on the part of his friend to propound the question. "What?" repeated Charlie Bates. "Aye, what?" said the Dodger. "Why, what should he say?" inquired Charlie, stopping rather suddenly in his merriment, for the Dodger's manner was impressive. "What should he say?" Mr. Dawkins whistled for a couple of minutes, and then taking off his hat, scratched his head and nodded thrice. "What do you mean?" said Charlie. "Tooraloo, gammon and spinach, the frog he wouldn't, and high cockalorum," said the Dodger with a slight sneer on his intellectual countenance. This was explanatory, but not satisfactory. Mr. Bates felt it so, and said again, "What do you mean?" The Dodger made no reply. Beetlejuice. His hat on again, and gathering the skirts of his long-tailed coat under his arms, thrust his tongue into his cheek, slapped the bridge of his nose some half-dozen times in a familiar but expressive manner, and then turning on his heel, slunk down the court. Mr. Bates followed, with a thoughtful countenance. The noise of footsteps on the creaking stairs a few minutes after the occurrence of this conversation roused the merry old gentleman as he sat over the fire with a saveloy and a small loaf in his left hand, a pocket-knife in his right, and a pewter pot on the trivet. There was a rascally smile on his white face as he turned round, and looking sharply out from under his thick red eyebrows, bent his ear towards the door, and listened intently. "Why, how's this?" muttered Mr. Fagin, changing countenance. "Oh, no, this is important." "Why, how's this?" muttered the angel, changing countenance. "Only two of 'em? Where's the third? They can't have got into trouble. Hark!" The footsteps approached nearer. They reached the landing. The door was slowly opened, and the Dodger and Charlie Bates entered and closed it behind them. "Where's Oliver, you young hounds?" said the furious angel, rising with a menacing look. "Where's the boy?" The young thieves eyed their preceptor, as if they were alarmed at his violence, and looked uneasily at each other, but made no reply. "What's become of the boy?" said the angel, seizing the Dodger tightly by the collar, and threatening him with horrid imprecations. "Speak out, or I'll throttle you." Mr. Fagin looked so very much In earnest, that. This is important. Charlie Bates, who deemed it prudent in all cases to be on the safe side, and conceived it by no means improbable that it might be his turn to be throttled second, dropped upon his knees, and raised a loud, well-sustained and continuous roar, something between an insane bull and a speaking trumpet. "Will you speak?" thundered the angel, shaking the dodger, so much that his keeping in the big coat at all seemed perfectly miraculous. "Why, the traps have got him, and that's all about it," said the dodger sullenly. "Come, let go of me, will ya?" And swinging himself at one jerk clean out of the big coat, which he left in the Jew's hands, the dodger snatched up the toasting fork and made a pass at the merry old gentleman's waistcoat, which, if it had taken effect, would have left a little more merriment out than could have been easily replaced in a month or two. Mr. Fagin stepped back in this emergency with more agility than could have been anticipated in a man of his apparent decrepitude, and seizing up the pot, prepared to hurl it at his assailant's head. But Charlie Bates, at this moment, calling his attention by a perfectly terrific howl, he suddenly altered its destination and flung it in full at that young gentleman. "Why, what's the blazes is in the wind now?" growled Wynne, and for as much goes a deep voice. "Who pitched that air at me? It's well. It is the beer, and not the pot, as hit me, or I'd have settled. Somebody I might have knowed as nobody but an infernal, rich, plundering, thundering old thug could afford to throw away and nay drink. But water, and not that, unless he done the river company every quarter. What's it all about, Fagin? Damn me, if my nakedture ain't lined with beer. Come in, you sneaking varmints. What are you stopping outside for? As if you were ashamed of your master? Come in." The man who growled out these words was a stoutly built fellow of about 45, in a black velveteen coat, very soiled drab breeches, lace-up half-boots, gray cotton stockings which enclosed a very bulky pair of legs, with large swelling calves, the kind of legs which in such a costume always look in an unfinished and incomplete state without a set of fretters to garnish them. He had a brown hat on his head, and a dirty Belcher handkerchief round his neck, with the long frayed ends of which he smeared the beer from his face as he spoke, disclosing when he had done so a broad, heavy countenance with a beard of 3 days' growth, and 2 scowling eyes, one of which displayed various party-colored symptoms of having been recently damaged by a blow. "Come in, do you hear?" growled this engaging-looking ruffian, a white, shaggy dog, with his face scratched and torn in 20 different places, skulked into the room. "Why didn't you come in afore?" said the man. "You're getting too proud to own me for company, aren't you? Lie down." This command was accompanied with a kick. A kick which sent the animal to the other end of the room. He appeared well used to it, however, for he coiled himself up in a corner very quietly without uttering a sound, and winking his very ill-looking eyes about 20 times in a minute, appeared to occupy himself in taking a survey of the apartment. "What are you up to? Ill-treating the boys, you covetous, avaricious, insatiable old fence," said the man, seating himself deliberately. "I wonder they don't murder you. I would if I was them. If I'd been your prentice, I'd have long done it ago. And no, I couldn't have sold you afterwards, though. For you're fit for nothing but keeping as a curiosity of ugliness in a glass bottle. And I suppose they don't blow them large enough. Hush, hush, Mr. Sykes, said the thug, trembling. Don't speak so loud. None of your mistering, replied the ruffian. You always mean mischief when you come that. You know my name. Out with it. I shan't disgrace it when the time comes. Well, well, then. Bill Sykes, said the thug with abject humility. You seem out of humor, Bill. Perhaps I am, replied Sykes. I should think you were rather out of sorts too, unless you mean as little harm when you throw pewter pots about as you do when you blab and... Are you mad? Said the Ithacan, catching the man by the sleeve and pointing towards the boys. Mr. Sykes contented himself with tying an imaginary knot around his left ear and jerking his head over the right shoulder, a piece of dumb show which the Ithacan appeared to understand perfectly. He then, in cant terms with which his whole conversation was plentifully besprinkled, but which would be quite unintelligible if they were recorded here, demanded a glass of liquor. And mind you don't poison it, said Mr. Sykes, laying his hat upon the table. This was said in jest, but if the speaker could have seen the evil leer with which the Ithacan bit his pale lip as he turned round to the cupboard, he might have thought the caution not wholly unnecessary, or the wish, at all events, to improve upon the distiller's ingenuity, not very far from the old gentleman's merry heart. After swallowing 2 or 3 glassfuls of spirits, Mr. Sykes condescended to take some notice of the young gentleman, which gracious act led to a conversation in which the cause and manner of Oliver's capture were circumstantially detailed, with such alterations and improvements on the truth as to the Dodger appeared most advisable under the circumstances. I'm afraid, said the Ithacan, that he may say something which will get us into trouble. That's very likely, returned Sykes with a malicious grin. You're blowed up, Fagin. And I'm afraid, you see, added the negative, speaking as if he had not noticed the interruption, and regarding the other closely as he did so. I'm afraid that if the game was up with us, it might be up with a good many more, and that it would come out rather worse for you than it would for me, my dear. The man started and turned fiercely round upon the Ithacan. But the old gentleman's shoulders were shrugged up to his ears, and his eyes were vacantly staring on the opposite wall. There was a long pause. Every member of the respectable coterie, C-O-T-E-R-I-E, coterie, appeared plunged in his own reflections, not excepting the dog, who, by a certain malicious licking of his lips, seemed to be meditating an attack upon the legs of the first gentleman or lady he might encounter in the street when he went out. Somebody must find out what's been done at the office, said Mr. Sykes in a much lower tone than he had taken since he came in. Somebody must find out what's been done at the office, said Mr. Sykes in a much lower tone than he had taken since he came in. The Ithacan nodded assent. If he hasn't peached and is committed, there's no fear till he comes out again, said Mr. Sykes. And then he must be taken care on. You must get hold of him somehow. Again the Ithacan nodded. The prudence of this line of action, indeed, was obvious. But Unfortunately, there was one very strong objection to its being adopted, and this was that the Dodger and Charlie Bates and Fagin and Mr. William Sykes happened one and all to entertain a most violent and deeply rooted antipathy to going near a police office on any ground or pretext whatever. How long they might have sat and looked at each other in a state of uncertainty, not the most pleasant of its kind, it's difficult to say. It is not necessary to make any guesses on the subject, however, for the sudden entrance of the two young ladies whom Oliver had seen on a former occasion caused the conversation to flow afresh. "The very thing," said the catechist. "Bet we'll go. Won't you, my dear?" "Where's?" inquired the young lady. "Only just up to the office, my dear," said the catechist, coaxingly. It is due to the young lady to say that she did not positively affirm that she would not, but that she merely expressed an emphatic and earnest desire to be jiggered if she would. A polite and delicate evasion of the request, which shows the young lady to have been possessed of that natural good breeding that cannot bear to inflict upon a fellow creature the pain of a direct and pointed refusal. The catechist's countenance fell, and he turned to the other young lady, who was gaily, not to say gorgeously attired in a red gown, green boots, and yellow curl papers. "Nancy, my dear," said the catechist in a soothing manner, "what do you say?" "That it won't do, so it's no use of trying it on, Fagin," replied Nancy. "What do you mean by that?" said Mr. Sykes, looking up in a surly manner. "What I say, Bill," replied the lady collectedly. "Why, you're just the very person for it," reasoned Mr. Sykes. "Nobody about here knows anything of you, and as I don't want 'em to, neither," replied Miss Nancy in the same composed manner. "It's rather more no than yes with me, Bill." "She'll go, Fagin," said Sykes. "No, she won't, Fagin," bawled Nancy. "Yes, she will, Fagin," said Sykes. And Mr. Sykes was right. By dint of alternate threats, promises, and bribes, the engaging female in question was ultimately prevailed upon to undertake the commission. She was not indeed withheld by the same considerations as her agreeable friend, for having very recently removed into the neighbourhood of Field Lane from the remote but genteel suburb of Ratcliffe, she was not under the same apprehension of being recognized by any of her numerous acquaintance. Accordingly, with a clean white apron tied over the red gown, and the yellow curl papers tucked up under a straw bonnet, both articles of dress being provided from the legislators, inexhaustible stock, Miss Nancy prepared to issue forth on her errand. "Stop a minute, my dear," said the legislator, producing a little covered basket. "Carry that in one hand. It looks more respectable, my dear." "Give her a door key to carry in her the other one, Fagin," said Sykes. "It looks real and genuine-like." Yes, my dear, so it does," said the legislator, hanging a large street door key to the forefinger of the young lady's right hand. "There. Very good indeed, my dear," said the legislator, rubbing his hands. "Oh, my brother, my poor, dear, sweet, innocent little brother," exclaimed Miss Nancy, bursting into tears and wringing the little basket and the street door key in an agony of distress. "What has become of him? Where have they taken him to? Oh, do have pity and tell me what's been done with the dear boy, gentlemen. Do, gentlemen, if you please, gentlemen. Having uttered these words in a most lamentable and heartbroken tone, to the immeasurable delight of her hearers, Miss Nancy paused, winked to the company, nodded, smiling round, and disappeared. "Ah, she's a clever girl, my dears," said the legislator, turning to his young friends and shaking his head gravely, as if in mute admonition to them to follow the bright example they had just beheld. "She's an honor to her sex," said Mr. Sikes, filling his glass and smiting the table with his enormous fist. "Here's her health, there's her health," and wishing they was all like her. While these and many other encomiums were being passed on the accomplished Miss Nancy, that young lady made the best of her way to the police office, whither, notwithstanding a little natural timidity consequent upon walking through the streets alone and unprotected, she arrived in perfect safety shortly afterwards. Entering by the back way, she tapped softly with the key at one of the cell doors and listened. There was no sound within. So she coughed and listened again. Still there was no reply, so she spoke. "Nolly, dear," murmured Nancy in a gentle voice. "Nolly?" There was nobody inside but a miserable, shoeless criminal, who had been taken up for playing the flute, and who, the offense against society having been clearly proved, had been very properly committed by Mr. Fang to the House of Correction for 1 month, with the appropriate and amusing remark that, since he had got so much breath to spare, it would be much more wholesomely expended on the treadmill than in a musical instrument. He made no answer, being occupied in mentally bewailing the loss of the flute, which had been confiscated for the use of the county. So Miss Nancy passed on to the next cell and knocked there. "Well?" cried a faint and feeble voice. "Is there a little boy here?" inquired Miss Nancy with a preliminary sob. "No," replied the voice. "God forbid." This was a vagrant of 65, who was going to prison for not playing the flute, or, in other words, for begging in the streets and doing nothing for his livelihood. In the next cell was another man, who was going to the same prison for hawking tin saucepans without a license, thereby doing something for his living, in defiance of the stamp office. But as neither of these criminals answered to the name of Oliver or knew anything about him, Miss Nancy made straight up to the bluff officer in the striped waistcoat, and with the most piteous wailings and lamentations, rendered more piteous by a prompt and efficient use of the street door key and the little basket, demanded her own dear brother. "I haven't got him here, my dear," said the old man. "Where is he?" screamed Miss Nancy in a distracted manner. "Why, the gentleman's got him," replied the officer. "What gentleman? Oh, gracious heavens, what gentleman?" exclaimed Miss Nancy. In reply to this incoherent questioning, the old man informed the deeply affected sister that Oliver had been taken ill in the office and discharged in consequence of a witness having proved the robbery to have been committed by another boy not in custody, and that the prosecutor had carried him away in an insensible condition to his own residence, of and concerning which all the sophist knew was that it was somewhere at Persia. he having heard that word mentioned in the directions to the coachman. In a dreadful state of doubt and uncertainty, the agonized young woman staggered to the gate, and then, exchanging her faltering gait for a good swift steady run, returned by the most devious and complicated route she could think of, to the domicile of the legislator. Mr. Bill Sykes no sooner heard the account of the expedition delivered than he very hastily called up the white dog, and putting on his hat, expeditiously departed. I wanted to say exported. Without devoting any time to the formality of wishing the company good morning. "We must know where he is, my dears. He must be found," said the legislator, greatly excited. "Charlie, do nothing but skulk about till you bring home some news of him. Nancy, my dear, I must have him found. I trust to you, my dear, to you and the artful for everything. Stay, added the legislator, unlocking a drawer with a shaking hand. "There's money, my dears. I shall shut up this shop tonight. You'll know where to find me. Don't stop here a minute. Not an instant, my dears." With these words he pushed them from the room, and carefully, double-locking and barring the door behind him, drew from its place of concealment the box which he had unintentionally disclosed to Oliver, and hastily proceeded to dispose the watches and jewellery beneath his clothing. A rap at the door startled him in this occupation. "Who's there?" he cried in a shrill tone of alarm. "Me," replied the voice of the Dodger through the keyhole. "What now?" cried the legislator impatiently. "Is he to be kidnapped to the other Qiien, Nancy says?" inquired Dodger cautiously. "Yes," replied the legislator. "Wherever she lays hands on him, find him out, that's all, and I shall know what to do next, never fear." The boy murmured a reply of intelligence and hurried downstairs after his companions. "He has not peached so far," said the legislator as he pursued his occupation. "If he means to blab us among his new friends, we may stop his windpipe yet." Everyone still with me? Chapter the 14th. Oliver soon recovered from the fainting fit into which Mr. Brownlow's abrupt exclamation had thrown him, and the subject of the picture was carefully avoided, both by the old gentleman and Miss Bedwin, in the conversation that ensued, which indeed bore no reference to Oliver's history or prospects, but was confined to such topics as might amuse without exciting him. He was still too weak to get up to breakfast, but when he came down into the housekeeper's room next day, his first act was to cast an eager glance at the wall, in the hope of again looking on the face of the beautiful lady. His expectations were disappointed, however, for the picture had been removed. "Ah," said the housekeeper, watching the direction of Oliver's eyes. "It's gone, you see." "I see it is, ma'am," replied Oliver with a sigh. "Why have they taken it away?" "It has been taken down, child, because Mr. Brownlow said that, as it seemed to worry you, perhaps it might prevent your getting well, you know," rejoined the old lady. "Oh, no, indeed, it didn't worry me, ma'am," said Oliver. "I liked to see it. I quite loved it." "Well, well," said the old lady good-humouredly, "you get well as fast as ever you can, dear, and it shall be hung up again. There, I promise you that. Now, let us talk about something else." This was all the information Oliver could obtain about the picture at that time, and as the old lady had been so kind to him in his illness, he endeavoured to think no more of the subject just then. So listened attentively to a great many stories she told him about an amiable and handsome daughter of hers, who was married to an amiable and handsome man, and lived in the country, and a son, who was clerk to a merchant in the West Indies, and who was also such a good young man, and wrote such dutiful letters home 4 times a year, that it brought the tears into her eyes to talk about them. When the old lady had expatiated a long time on the excellencies of her children, and the merits of her good, kind husband besides, who had been dead and gone, poor dear soul, just 26 years, It was time to have tea, and after tea she began to teach Oliver cribbage, which he learnt as quickly as she could teach, and at which game they played with great interest and gravity, until it was time for the invalid to have some warm wine and water with a slice of dry toast, and to go cozily to bed. They were happy days, those of Oliver's recovery. Everything was so quiet and neat and orderly, everybody so kind and gentle, that after the noise and turbulence in the midst of which he had always lived, it seemed like heaven itself. He was no sooner strong enough to put his clothes on properly than Mr. Brownlow caused a complete new suit, and a new cap, and a new pair of shoes to be provided for him. As Oliver was told that he might do what he liked with his old clothes, he gave them to a servant who had been very kind to him, and asked her to sell them to Cupid, and keep the money. For herself. This she very readily did, and as Oliver looked out of the parlor window and saw Cupid roll them up in his bag and walk away, he felt quite delighted to think that they were safely gone, and that there was now no possible danger of his ever being able to wear them again. They were sad rags, to tell the truth, and Oliver had never had a new suit before. One evening, about a week after the affair of the picture, as Oliver was sitting talking to Mrs. Bedwin, there came a message down from Mr. Brownlow that if Oliver Twist felt pretty well, he should like to see him in his study and talk to him a little while. "Bless us and save us! Wash your hands and let me part your hair nicely for you, child," said Mrs. Bedwin. "Dear heart alive, if we'd known we would have asked for you. We would have put you a clean collar on and made you as smart as sixpence." Oliver did as the old lady bade him, and although she lamented grievously meanwhile that there was not even time to crimp the little frill that bordered his shirt collar, he looked so delicate and handsome, despite that important personal advantage, that she went so far as to say, looking at him with great complacency from head to foot, that she really didn't think it would have been possible on the longest notice to have made a much difference in him for the better. Thus encouraged, Oliver tapped at the study door, and on Mr. Brownlow calling to him to come in, found himself in a little back room quite full of books, with a window looking into some pleasant little gardens. There was a table drawn up before the window, at which Mr. Brownlow was seated, reading. When he saw Oliver, he pushed the book away. Of the picture from him, and told him to come near the table and sit down. Oliver complied, marveling where the people could be found to read such a great number of books as seemed to be written to make the world wiser, which is still a marvel to more experienced people than Oliver Twist every day of their lives. "There are a good many books, are there not, my boy?" said Mr. Brownlow, observing the curiosity with which Oliver surveyed the shelves that reached from the floor to the ceiling. "A great number, sir," replied Oliver. "I never saw so many." "You shall read them if you behave well," said the old gentleman kindly, "and you will like that, better than looking at the outsides, that is, in some cases, because there are books of which the backs and covers are by far the best parts." Do I have it in me to read this guy right? "You shall read them if you behave well," said the old gentleman kindly, "and you will like that better than looking at the outsides, that is, in some cases, because there are books of which the backs and covers are by far the best parts." "I suppose they are those heavy ones, sir?" said Oliver, pointing to some large quartos with a good deal of gilding about the binding. Not those, said the old gentleman, patting Oliver on the head and smiling as he did so, but other, equally heavy ones, though of a much smaller size. How should you like to grow up a clever man and write books, eh? I think I'd rather read them, sir, replied Oliver. What? Wouldn't you like to be a book writer? Said the old gentleman. Oliver considered a little while, and at last said he should think it would be a much better thing to be a bookseller, upon which the old gentleman laughed heartily and declared he had said a very good thing, which Oliver felt glad to have done, though he by no means knew what it was. Well, well, said the old gentleman, composing his features, don't be afraid. We won't make an author of you, while there's an honest trade to be learnt, or brick-making to turn to. Thank you, sir, said Oliver. And at the earnest manner of his reply, the old gentleman laughed again, and said something about a curious instinct, which Oliver, not understanding, paid no very great attention to. Now, said Mr. Brownlow, speaking if possible in a kinder, but at the same time in a much more serious manner than Oliver had ever heard him speak in yet, I want you to pay great attention, my boy, to what I'm going to say. I shall talk to you without any reserve, because I'm sure you are as well able to understand me as many older persons would be. Oh, don't tell me you're going to send me away, sir, pray, exclaimed Oliver, alarmed by the serious tone of the old gentleman's commencement. Don't turn me out of doors to wander in the streets again. Let me stay here and be a servant. Don't send me back to the wretched place I came from. Have mercy upon a poor boy, sir, do. My dear child, said the gentleman, moved by the warmth of Oliver's sudden appeal, you need not be afraid of my deserting you, unless you give me cause. I never will, sir, interposed Oliver. I hope not, rejoined the old gentleman. I do not think you ever will. I have been deceived before in the objects whom I have endeavored to benefit, but I feel strongly disposed to trust you, nevertheless, and more strongly interested in your behalf than I can well account for, even to myself. The persons on whom I have bestowed my dearest love lie deep in their graves. But although the happiness and delight of my life lie buried there too, I have not made a coffin of my heart yet, and sealed it up forever on my best affections. Deep affliction has only made them stronger. It ought, I think, for it should refine our nature. As the old gentleman said this in a low voice, more to himself than to his companion, and remained silent for a short time afterwards, Oliver sat quite still, almost afraid to breathe. Well, well, said the old gentleman at length in a more cheerful voice. Really, do I have the energy to say what this guy says? Well, well, said the old gentleman at length in a more cheerful voice. I only say this because you have a young heart, and knowing that I have suffered great pain and sorrow, you will be more careful, perhaps, not to wound me again. You say you are an orphan, without a friend in the world, and all the inquiries I've been able to make confirm the statement. Let me hear your story. Where you came from, who brought you up, and how you got into the company in which I found you. Speak the truth, and if I find you have committed no crime, you will never be friendless while I live. Oliver's sobs quite checked his utterance for some minutes, and just when he was on the point of beginning to relate how he had been brought up the farm, and carried to the workhouse by Mr. Bumble, a peculiarly impatient little double knock was heard at the street door, and the servant, running upstairs, announced Mr. Grimwig. "Is he coming up?" inquired Mr. Brownlow. "Yes, sir," replied the servant. "He asked if there were any muffins in the house, and when I told him yes, he said he had come to tea." Mr. Brownlow smiled, and turning to Oliver said Mr. Grimwig was an old friend of his, and he must not mind his being a little rough in his manners, for he was a worthy creature at bottom, as he had reason to know. "Shall I go downstairs, sir?" inquired Oliver. "No," replied Mr. Brownlow. "I would rather you stopped here." At this moment there walked into the room, supporting himself by a thick stick, a stout old gentleman, rather lame in one leg, who was dressed in a blue coat, a striped waistcoat, nankeen breeches and gaiters, and a broad-brimmed white hat, with the sides turned up with green. A very small plaited shirt frill stuck out from his waistcoat, and a very long steel watch chain with nothing but a key at the end dangled loosely below it. "I know what you mean." The ends of his white neckerchief were twisted into a ball about the size of an orange. The variety of shapes into which his countenance was twisted defied description. He had a manner of screwing his head round on one side when he spoke, and looking out of the corners of his eyes at the same time, which irresistibly reminded the beholder of a parrot. In this attitude he fixed himself the moment he made his appearance, and holding out a small piece of orange peel at arm's length, exclaimed in a growling, discontented voice, "Look here, do you see this? Isn't it a most wonderful and extraordinary thing that I can't call at a man's house, but I find a piece of this cursed poor surgeon's friend on the staircase? I've been lamed with orange peel once, and I know orange peel will be my death at last. It will, sir. Orange peel will be my death, or I'll be content to eat my own head, sir." This was the handsome offer with which Mr. Grimwig backed and confirmed nearly every assertion he made, and it was the more singular in his case because, even admitting for the sake of argument the possibility of scientific improvements being ever brought to that pass which will enable a gentleman to eat his own head in the event of his being so disposed, Mr. Grimwig's head was such a particularly large one that the most sanguine man alive could hardly entertain a hope of being able to get through it at a sitting, to put entirely out of the question a very thick coating of powder. "I'll eat my head, sir," repeated Mr. Grimwig, striking his stick upon the ground. "Hello, what's that?" he added, looking at Oliver and retreating a pace or two. "This is young Oliver Twist, whom we were speaking about," said Mr. Brownlow. Oliver bowed. "You don't mean to say that's the boy that had the fever, I hope," said Mr. Grimwig, recoiling a little further. "Wait a minute. Don't speak. Stop," continued Mr. Grimwig, abruptly, losing all dread of the fever in his triumph at the discovery. "That's the boy that had the orange. If that's not the boy, sir, that had the orange, and threw this bit of peel upon the staircase, I'll eat my head and his too." No, he has not had one," said Mr. Brownlow, laughing. "Come, put down your hat and speak to my young friend." "I feel strongly on this subject, sir," said the irritable old gentleman, drawing off his gloves. "There's always more or less orange peel on the pavement in our street, and I know it's put there by the surgeon's boy at the corner. A young woman stumbled over a bit last night, and fell against my garden railings. Directly she got up, I saw her look towards this infernal red lamp with the pantomime light. 'Don't go to him,' I called out of the window. 'He's an assassin, a man-trap.' So he is, if he is not." Here the irascible old gentleman gave a great knock on the ground with his stick, which was always understood by his friends to imply the customary offer whenever it was not expressed in words. "Hurry up." Then, still keeping his stick in his hand, he sat down, and opening a double eyeglass, which he wore attached to a broad black ribbon, took a view of Oliver, who, seeing that he was the object of inspection, colored and bowed again. "That's the boy, is it?" said Mr. Grimwig at length. "That's the boy," replied Mr. Brownlow, nodding good-humouredly to Oliver. "How are you, boy?" said Mr. Grimwig. "A great deal better, thank you, sir," replied Oliver. Mr. Brownlow, seeming to apprehend that his singular friend was about to say something disagreeable, asked Oliver to step downstairs and tell Mrs. Bedwin they were ready for tea, which, as he did not half like the visitor's manner, he was very happy to do. "He's a nice-looking boy, is he not?" inquired Mr. Brownlow. "I don't know," replied Grimwig pettishly. "Don't know?" "No, I don't know. I never see any difference in boys. I only know two sorts of boys. Mealy boys and beef-faced boys." "And which is Oliver?" "Mealy. I know a friend who's got a beef-faced boy. A fine boy, they call him, with a round head and red cheeks and glaring eyes. A horrid boy, with a body and limbs that appear to be swelling out of the seams of his blue clothes, with the voice of a pilot and the appetite of a wolf. I know him, the wretch." "Come," said Mr. Brownlow, "these are not the characteristics of young Oliver Twist, so he needn't excite your wrath." "They are not," replied Grimwig. "He may have worse." Here Mr. Brownlow coughed impatiently, which appeared to afford Mr. Grimwig the most exquisite delight. "He may have worse, I say," repeated Mr. Grimwig. "Where does he come from? Who is he? What is he? He has had a fever." "What of that? Fevers are not peculiar to good people, are they? Bad people have fevers sometimes, haven't they, eh? I knew a man that was hung in Jamaica for murdering his master. He had had a fever 6 times. He wasn't recommended to mercy on that account." "Pfft, nonsense." Now, the fact was that, in the inmost recesses of his own heart, Mr. Grimwig was strongly disposed to admit that Oliver's appearance and manner were unusually prepossessing, but he had a strong appetite for contradiction, sharpened on this occasion by the finding of the orange peel, and inwardly determining that no man should dictate to him whether a boy was well-looking or not. He had resolved from the first to oppose his friend. When Mr. Brownlow admitted that on to one point of inquiry could he yet return any satisfactory answer. Oh, I got that totally wrong. When Mr. Brownlow admitted that on no one point of inquiry could he yet return any satisfactory answer, and that he had postponed any investigation into Oliver's previous history until he thought the boy was strong enough to bear it, Mr. Grimwig chuckled maliciously and demanded with a sneer whether the housekeeper was in the habit of counting the plate at night, because if she didn't find a tablespoon or 2 missing some sunshiny morning, why, he would be content to, etc. All this Mr. Brownlow, although himself somewhat of an impetuous gentleman, knowing his friend's peculiarities, bore with great good humour, and as Mr. Grimwig, at tea, was graciously pleased to express his entire approval of the muffins, matters went on very smoothly, and Oliver, who made one of the party, began to feel more at his ease than he had yet done in the fierce old gentleman's presence. "And when are you going to hear a full, true, and particular account of the life and adventures of Oliver Twist?" asked Grimwig. Gutenberg? Grimwig Press. Of Mr. Brownlow, at the conclusion of the meal, looked sideways at Oliver as he resumed the subject. "Tomorrow morning," replied Mr. Brownlow. "I would rather he was alone with me at the time. Come up to me tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock, my dear." "Yes, sir," replied Oliver. He answered with some hesitation, because he was confused by Mr. Grimwig's looking so hard at him. "I'll tell you what," whispered the gentleman to Mr. Brownlow. "I'll tell you what," whispered the gentleman to Mr. Brownlow. "He won't come up to you tomorrow morning. I saw him hesitate. He is deceiving you, my dear friend." "I'll swear he is not," replied Mr. Brownlow warmly. "If he is not," said Mr. Grimwig, "I'll—" and down went the stick. "I'll answer for that boy's truth with my life," said Mr. Brownlow, knocking the table. "And I for his falsehood with my head," rejoined Mr. Grimwig, knocking the table also. "We shall see," said Mr. Brownlow, checking his rising passion. "We will," replied Mr. Grimwig with a provoking smile. "We will." As fate would have it, Mrs. Bedwin chanced to bring in at this moment a small parcel of books, which Mr. Brownlow had that morning purchased of the identical bookstall keeper who has already figured in this history, which, having laid on the table, she prepared to leave the room. "I love her." "I don't admit it." "Stop the boy, Mrs. Bedwin," said Mr. Brownlow. "There is something to go back." "He has gone, sir," replied Mrs. Bedwin. "Call after him," said Mr. Brownlow. "It's particular. He's a poor man, and they're not paid for. There are some books to be taken back, too." The street door was opened. Oliver ran one way, and the girl another, and Mrs. Bedwin stood on the step and screamed for the boy, but there was no boy in sight, and both Oliver and the girl returned in a breathless state to report that there were no tidings of him. "Dear me, I'm very sorry for that," exclaimed Mr. Brownlow. "I particularly wished those books to be returned tonight." "Send Oliver with them," said Mr. Grimwig with an ironical smile. "He'll be sure to deliver them safely, you know." "Yes, do. Let me take them, if you please, sir," said Oliver. "I'll run all the way, sir." The old gentleman was just going to say that Oliver should not go out on any account, when a most malicious cough from Mr. Grimwig determined him that he should, and by his prompt discharge of the commission proved to him the injustice of his suspicions, on this head at least, at once. "You shall go, my dear," said the old gentleman. "The books are on a chair by my table. Fetch them down." Oliver, delighted to be of use, brought down the books under his arm in a great bustle, and waited, cap in hand, to hear what message he was to take. "You are to say," said Mr. Brownlow, glancing steadily at Grimwig, "you are to say that you have brought those books back, and that you have come to pay the £4.10 I owe him. This is a £5 note, so you will have to bring me back 10 shillings change." "I won't be 10 minutes, sir," replied Oliver eagerly, and having buttoned up the banknote in his jacket pocket, and placing the books carefully under his arm, he made a respectful bow, and left the room. Mrs. Bedwin followed him to the street door, giving him many directions about the nearest way, and the name of the bookseller and the name of the street, all of which Oliver said he clearly understood, and having superadded many injunctions to be sure and not take cold, the careful old lady at length permitted him to depart. "Bless his sweet face," said the old lady, looking after him. "I can't bear, somehow, to let him go out of my sight." At this moment Oliver looked gaily round, and nodded before he turned the corner. The old lady smilingly returned his salutation, and closing the door, went back to her own room. "Let me see. He'll be back in 20 minutes, at the longest," said Mr. Brownlow, pulling out his watch and placing it on the table. "It will be dark by that time." "Oh, you really expect him to come back, do you?" inquired Mr. Grimwig. "Don't you?" asked Mr. Brownlow, smiling. The spirit of contradiction was strong in Mr. Grimwig's breast at that moment, and it was rendered stronger by his friend's confident smile. "No," he said, smiting the table with his fist, "I do not. The boy has got a new suit of clothes on his back, a set of valuable books under his arm, and a £5 note in his pocket. He'll join his old friends, the thieves, and laugh at you. If ever that boy returns to this house, sir, I'll eat my head." With these words, he drew his chair closer to the table, and there the two friends sat in silent expectation, with the watch between them. It is worthy of remark, as illustrating the importance we attach to our own judgments and the pride with which we put forth our most harsh, quote, rash and hasty conclusions, that, although Mr. Grimwig was not a bad-hearted man, and would have been unfeignedly sorry to see his respected friend duped and deceived, he really did most earnestly, strongly hope at that moment that Oliver Twist might not come back. Of such contradictions is human nature made up. It grew so dark that the figures on the dial were scarcely discernible, but there the two old gentlemen continued to sit in silence, with the watch between them. While Noah Claypole was going to murder Oliver, let me tell you, Charles Dickens is murdering me. This is a lot. Chapter the 15th. If it did not come strictly within the scope and bearing of my long-considered intentions and plans regarding this prose epic, for such I mean it to be, to leave the two old gentlemen sitting with the watch between them long after it grew too dark to see it, and both doubting Oliver's return, the one in triumph and the other in sorrow, I might take occasion to entertain the reader with many wise reflections on the obvious impolicy of ever attempting to do good to our fellow creatures where there is no hope of earthly reward, or rather on the strict policy of betraying some slight degree of charity or sympathy in one particularly unpromising case, and then abandoning such weakness forever. I am aware that, in advising even this slight dereliction from the paths of prudence and worldliness, I lay myself open to the censure of many excellent and respectable persons who have long walked therein. But I venture to contend, nevertheless, that the advantages of the proceeding are manifold and lasting, as thus, if the object selected should happen most unexpectedly to turn out well, and to thrive, and amend upon the assistance you have afforded him, he will, in pure gratitude and fullness of heart, laud your goodness to the skies. Your character will be thus established, and you will pass through the world as a most estimable person, who does a vast deal of good in secret, not 1/20th part of which will ever see the light. If, on the contrary, his bad character become notorious and his profligacy, P-R-O-F-L-I-G-A-C-Y, profligacy, a byword, you place yourself in the excellent position of having attempted to bestow relief most disinterestedly, of having become misanthropical in consequence of the treachery of its object, and of having made a rash and solemn vow, which no one regrets more than yourself, never to help or relieve any man, woman, or child again, lest you should be similarly deceived. I know a great number of persons in both situations at this moment, and I can safely assert that they are the most generally respected and esteemed of any in the whole circle of my acquaintance. But as Mr. Brownlow was not one of these, as he obstinately persevered in doing good for its own sake, and the gratification of heart it yielded him, as no failure dispirited him, and no ingratitude in individual cases tempted him to wreak his vengeance on the whole human race, I shall not enter into any such digression in this place, and if this be such not a sufficient reason for this determination, I have a better, and indeed a wholly unanswerable one, already stated, which is that it forms no part of my original intention to do so to do. In the obscure parlor of a low public house, situate in the filthiest part of Little Saffron Hill, a dark and gloomy den, where a flaring gaslight burnt all day in the winter-time, and where no ray of sun ever shone in the summer, there sat, brooding over a little pewter measure and a small glass, strongly impregnated with the smell of liquor, a man in a velveteen coat, drab short half-boots and stockings, whom, even by that dim light, no experienced agent of police would have hesitated for one moment to recognize. Instant to recognize. Quote, as Mr. William Sykes. At his feet sat a white-coated, red-eyed dog who occupied himself alternately in winking at his master with both eyes at the same time, and in licking a large, fresh cut on one side of his mouth, a most critical point for one or other, when the door suddenly opening, the dog darted out, leaving Bill Sykes with the poker and the clasp knife in his hands. There must always be two parties to a quarrel, says the old adage, and Mr. Sykes, being disappointed of the dog's presence, at once transferred the quarrel to the newcomer. What the devil do you come in between me and my dog for? Said Sykes with a fierce gesture. I didn't know, my dear, I didn't know, replied Fagin humbly. For he was the newcomer. Didn't know, you white-livered thief, growled Sykes. Couldn't you hear the noise? Not a sound of it, as I'm a living man, Bill, replied he. Oh, no, you hear nothing, you don't, retorted Sykes with a fierce sneer, sneaking in and out, so as nobody hears how you come or go. I wish you'd been the dog, Fagin, half a minute ago. Why? Inquired he with a forced smile. 'Cause the government, as cares for the lives of such men as you, as haven't half the pluck of curs, lets a man kill his dog how he likes, replied Sykes, shutting the knife up with a very expressive look. That's why. He rubbed his hands, and sitting down at the table affected to laugh at the pleasantry of his friend, obviously very ill at his ease, however. Grin away, said Sykes, replacing the poker and surveying him with savage contempt. Grin away. You'll never have the laugh at me, though, unless it's behind a nightcap. I've got the upper hand over you, Fagin, and damn me, I'll keep it. There. The invisible hand of capitalism. Hospitals. If I go, you go. So take care of me. Well, well, my dear, said he. I know all that. We have a mutual interest, Bill. A mutual interest. Said Sykes, as if he thought the interest lay rather more on the angel's side than on his. Well, what have you got to say to me? It's all passed safe through the melting pot, replied Fagin, and this is your share. It's rather more than it ought to be, my dear, but as I know you'll do me a good turn another time, and— Stow that, gammon, interposed the robber impatiently. Where is it? Hand over. Yes, Bill. Give me time, replied he soothingly. Here it is, all safe. As he spoke, he drew forth an old cotton handkerchief from his breast, and untying a large knot in one corner, produced a small brown paper packet, which Sykes, snatching from him, hastily opened, and proceeded to count the sovereigns it contained. This is all, is it? Inquired Sykes. All, replied he. You haven't opened the parcel and swallowed one or two as you come along, have you? Inquired Sykes suspiciously. Don't put on an injured look at the question. You've done it many a time, jerked the tinkler. These words, in plain English, conveyed an injunction to ring the bell. It was answered by let's try this. Another angel, younger than Cupid, but nearly as vile and repulsive in appearance. Bill Sykes merely pointed to the empty measure, and the angel, perfectly understanding the hint, retired to fill it, previously exchanging a remarkable look with Cupid, who raised his eyes for an instant, as if in expectation of it, and shook his head in reply so slightly that the action would have been almost imperceptible to a third person. It was lost upon Sykes, who was stooping at the moment to tie the bootlace which the dog had torn. Possibly, if he had observed the brief interchange of signals, he might have thought that it boded no good to him. Is anybody here, Barney? Inquired Cupid, speaking, now that Sykes was looking on, without raising his eyes from the ground. That's us all, replied Barney, whose words, whether they came from the heart or not, made their way through the nose. Nobody? Inquired Cupid in a tone of surprise, which perhaps might mean that Barney was at liberty to tell the truth. Nobody but Miss Nancy, replied Barney. Miss Nancy? Exclaimed Sykes. Where? Strike me blind if I don't honor that here girl for her native talents. She's been having a plate of boiled beef in the bar, replied Barney. Send her here, said Sykes, pouring out a glass of liquor. Send her here. Barney looked timidly. My eyes are blurry. What's this word? As? As Cupid. As? If for permission. The angel remaining silent, not lifting his eyes from the ground, he retired, and presently returned, ushering in Miss Nancy, who was decorated with a bonnet, apron, basket, and street door key complete. You're on the scent, are you, Nancy? Inquired Sykes, proffering the glass. Yes, I am, Bill, replied the young lady, disposing of its contents. And tired enough of it I am, too. The young brat's been ill and confined to the crib, and— Nancy, dear, said Cupid, looking up. Now, whether a peculiar contraction of his red eyebrows and a half-closing of his deeply set eyes warned Miss Nancy that she was disposed to be too communicative is not a matter of much importance. The fact is all we need care for here, and the fact is that she suddenly checked herself, and with several gracious smiles upon Mr. Sykes, turned the conversation to other matters. In about 10 minutes' time, Mr. Fagin was seized with a fit of coughing, upon which Miss Nancy pulled her shawl over her shoulders, and declared it was time to go. Mr. Sykes, finding that he was walking a short part of her way himself, expressed his intention of accompanying her, and they went away together, followed at a little distance by the dog, who slunk out of a backyard as soon as his master was out of sight. The angel thrust his head out of the room door when Sykes had left it, looked after him as he walked up the dark passage, shook his clenched fist, muttered a deep curse, and then with a horrible grin reseated himself at the table, where he was soon deeply absorbed in the interesting passages of the Holy Gospel. Was the hue and cry, whatever that is. Meanwhile, Oliver Twist, little dreaming that he was within so very short a distance of the merry old gentleman, was on his way to the bookstall. When he got into Clerkenwell, he accidentally turned down a by-street which was not exactly in his way, but not discovering his mistake till he had got halfway down it, and knowing it must lead in the right direction, he did not think it worthwhile to turn back, and so marched on, as quickly as he could, with the books under his arm. He was walking along, thinking how happy and contented he ought to feel, and how much he would give for only one look at a poor little Dick, who, starved and beaten, might be lying dead at that very moment, when he was startled by a young woman screaming out very loud, "Oh, my dear brother!" And he had hardly looked up to see what the matter was, when he was stopped by having a pair of arms thrown tight round his neck. "Don't!" cried Oliver, struggling. "Let go of me! Who is it? What are you stopping me for?" The only reply to this was a great number of loud lamentations from the young woman who had embraced him, and who had got a little basket and a street-door key in her hand. "Oh, my gracious," said the young woman, "I've found him. Oh, Oliver, Oliver! Oh, you naughty boy, to make me suffer such distress on your account. Come home, dear, come. Oh, I've found him. Thank gracious goodness heavens, I've found him." With these incoherent exclamations, the young woman burst into another fit of crying. And got so dreadfully hysterical that a couple of women who came up at the moment asked a butcher's boy, with a shiny head of hair anointed with suet, who was also looking on, whether he didn't think he had better run for the doctor. To which the butcher's boy, who appeared of a lounging, not to say indolent disposition, replied that he thought not. "Oh, no, no, never mind," said the young woman, grasping Oliver's hand. "I'm better now. Come home directly, you cruel boy, come." "What's the matter, ma'am?" inquired one of the women. "Oh, ma'am," replied the young woman, "he ran away near a month ago from his parents, who are hard-working and respectable people, and joined a set of thieves and bad characters, and almost broke his mother's heart." "Young wretch," said one woman, quote, "Go home, do, you little brute," said the other. "I'm not," replied Oliver, greatly alarmed. "I don't know her. I haven't got any sister, or father, or mother either. I'm an orphan. I live at Pentonville." "Oh, only hear him, how he braves it out," cried the young woman. "Why, it's Nancy!" exclaimed Oliver, who now saw her face for the first time, and started back in irrepressible astonishment. "You see, he knows me," cried Nancy, appealing to the bystanders. "He can't help himself. Make him come home. There's good people, or he'll kill his dear mother and father, and break my heart." "What's the devil's this?" said a man bursting out of a beer shop with a white dog at his heels. "Young Oliver! Come home to your poor mother, you young dog. Come home directly." "I don't belong to them. I don't know them. Help! Help!" cried Oliver, struggling in the man's powerful grasp. "Help!" repeated the man. "Yes, I'll help you, you young rascal. What books are these? You've been a-stealing 'em, have you? Give 'em here." With these words, the man tore the volumes from his grasp and struck him violently on the head. "That's right," cried a looker-on from a garret window. "That's the only way of bringing him to his senses." "To be sure," cried a sleepy-faced carpenter, casting an approving look at the garret window. "It'll do him good," said the two women. "And he shall have it, too," rejoined the man, administering another blow and seizing Oliver by the collar. "Come on, you young villain. Here, Bullseye, mind him, boy, mind him." Weak with recent illness, stupefied by the blows and the suddenness of the attack, terrified by the fierce growling of the dog and the brutality of the man, and overpowered by the conviction of the bystanders that he was really the hardened little wretch he was described to be, what could one poor child do? Darkness had set in. It was a low neighborhood. No help was near. Resistance was useless. In another moment he was dragged into a labyrinth of dark, narrow courts, and forced along them at a pace which rendered the few cries he dared to give utterance to wholly unintelligible. It was of little moment, indeed, whether they were intelligible or not, for there was nobody to care for them, they had been ever so plain. The gas lamps were lighted. Mrs. Bedouin was waiting anxiously at the open door. The servant had run up the street 20 times to see if there were any traces of Oliver, and still the two old gentlemen sat perseveringly in the dark parlor, with the watch between them. Hello, this is Stephen reading from Oliver Twist. The narrow streets and courts at length terminated in a large open space, scattered about which were pens for beasts and other indications of a cattle market. Sykes slackened his pace when they reached this spot, the girl being quite unable to support any longer the rapid rate at which they had hitherto walked, and turning to Oliver, commanded him roughly to take hold of Nancy's hand. "Do you hear?" growled Sykes, as Oliver hesitated and looked round. They were in a dark corner, quite out of the track of passengers, and Oliver saw but too plainly that resistance would be of no avail. He held out his hand, which Nancy clasped tight in hers. "Give me the other," said Sykes, seizing Oliver's unoccupied hand. "Here, Bullseye." The dog looked up and growled. "See here, boy," said Sykes, putting his other hand to Oliver's throat, and uttering a savage oath. "If he speaks ever so soft a word, hold him. Do you mind?" The dog growled again, and licking his lips, eyed Oliver as if he were anxious to attach himself to his windpipe without any unnecessary delay. "He's as willing as a Christian. Strike me blind if he isn't," said Sykes, regarding the animal with a kind of grim and ferocious approval. "Now you know what you've got to expect, master, so call away as quick as you like. The dog will soon stop that game. Get on, young'un." Bullseye wagged his tail in acknowledgment of this unusually endearing form of speech, and giving vent to another admonitory growl for the benefit of Oliver, led the way onward. It was Smithfield that they were crossing, although it might have been Grosvenor Square, for anything Oliver knew to the contrary. The night was dark and foggy, and it was just beginning to rain. Sheets of rain. The lights in the shops could scarcely struggle through the heavy mist, which thickened every moment, and shrouded the streets and houses in gloom, rendering the strange place still stranger in Oliver's eyes, and making his uncertainty the more dismal and depressing. They had hurried on a few paces when a deep church bell struck the hour. With its first stroke, the two conductors stopped and turned their heads in the direction whence the sound proceeded. 8 o'clock, Bill. What's the good of telling me that? I can hear, can't I? Replied Sykes. I wonder where they can hear it, said Nancy. Of course they can, replied Sykes. It was Bartlemy time when I was shopped, and there weren't a penny trumpet in the fair as I couldn't hear the squeaking on. Arter I was locked up for the night, the row went in outside made the thundering old jail so silent that I could almost have beat my brains out against the iron plates of the door. Poor fellows, said Nancy, who still had her face turned towards the quarter in which the bell had sounded. Oh, Bill, such fine young chaps as them? Yes, that's what all you women think of, answered Sykes. Fine young chaps. Well, they're as good as dead, so it doesn't much matter. With this consolation, Mr. Sykes appeared to repress a rising tendency to jealousy, and clasping Oliver's wrist more firmly, told him to step out again. Wait a minute, said the girl. I wouldn't hurry by. If it was you that was coming out to be hung the next time 8 o'clock struck, Bill, I'd walk round and round the place till I dropped if the snow was on the ground and I hadn't a shawl to cover me. And what good would that do? Inquired the unsentimental Mr. Sykes. Unless you could pitch over a file and 20 yards of good stout rope, you might as well be walking 50 mile off, or not walking at all, for all the good it would do me. Come on, will you? Don't stand preaching there. The girl burst into a laugh, drew her shawl more closely round her, and they walked away. But Oliver felt her hand tremble, and looking up in her face as they passed a gas lamp, saw that it had turned a deadly white. They walked on by little frequented and dirty ways for a full half-hour, meeting very few people, for it now rained heavily, and those they did meet appearing from their looks to hold much the same position in society as Mr. Sykes himself. At length they turned into a very filthy narrow street, nearly full of old clothes shops, and the dog, running forward, as if conscious that there was now no further occasion for his keeping on guard, stopped before the door of a shop which was closed, and apparently untenanted, for the house was in a ruinous condition, and upon the door was nailed a board, intimating that it was to let, which looked as if it had hung there for many years. All right, said Sykes, looking cautiously about. Nancy stooped below the shutters, and Oliver heard the sound of a bell. They crossed to the opposite side of the street, and stood for a few moments under a lamp. A noise, as if a sash window were gently raised, was heard, and soon afterwards the door softly opened, upon which Mr. Sykes seized the terrified boy by the collar with very little ceremony, and all three were quickly inside the house. The passage was perfectly dark, and they waited while the person who had let them in chained and barred the door. "Anybody here?" inquired Sykes. "No," replied a voice, which Oliver thought he had heard before. "Is the old un here?" asked the robber. "Yes," replied the voice, "and precious down in the mouth if he has been. Won't he be glad to see you? Oh, no." The style of this reply, as well as the voice which delivered it, seemed familiar to Oliver's ears, but it was impossible to distinguish even the form of the speaker in the darkness. "Let's have a glim," said Sykes, "or we shall go breaking our necks or treading on the dog. Look after your legs if you do, that's all." "Stand still a moment, and I'll get you one," replied the voice. The receding footsteps of the speaker were heard, and in another minute the form of Mr. John Dawkins, otherwise the Artful Dodger, appeared, bearing in his right hand a tallow candle, stuck in the end of a cleft stick. The young gentleman did not stop to bestow any other mark of recognition upon Oliver than a humorous grin, but turning away, beckoned the visitors to follow him down a flight of stairs. They crossed an empty kitchen, and opening the door of a low, earthy-smelling room, which seemed to have been built in a small backyard, were received with a shout of laughter. "Oh, my wig, my wig!" cried Master Charlie Bates, from whose lungs the laughter had proceeded. "Here he is, oh cry, here he is, oh." "Fagin, look at him. Fagin, do look at him. I can't bear it. It is such a jolly game, I can't bear it. Hold me, somebody, while I laugh it out." With this irrepressible ebullition of mirth, Master Bates laid himself flat on the floor and kicked convulsively for 5 minutes in an ecstasy of facetious joy. Then, jumping to his feet, he snatched the cleft stick from the dodger, and advancing to Oliver, viewed him round and round. While Fagin, taking off his nightcap, made a great number of low bows to the bewildered boy. The artful, meantime, who was of a rather saturnine disposition and seldom gave way to merriment when it interfered with business, rifling his pockets with steady assiduity. "Look at his togs, Fagin," said Charlie, putting the light so close to Oliver's new jacket as nearly to set him on fire. "Look at his togs. Superfine cloth and the heavy swell cut. Oh, my eye, what a game! And his books, too. Nothing but a gentleman, Fagin." "Delighted to see you looking so well, my dear," said the angel, bowing with mock humility. "The artful shall give you another suit, my dear, for fear you should spoil that Sunday one. Why didn't you write, my dear, and say you were coming? We'd have got something warm for supper." At this, Master Bates roared again so loud that Fagin himself relaxed, and even the Dodger smiled. But as the artful drew forth the 5-pound note at that instant, it is doubtful whether the sally or the discovery awakened his merriment. "Hello, what's that?" inquired Sykes, stepping forward as Fagin seized the note. "That's mine, Fagin." "No, no, my dear," said Fagin. "Mine, Bill, mine. You shall have the books." "If that ain't mine," said Sykes, putting on his hat with a determined air. "Mine and Nancy's, that is. I'll take the boy back again." Fagin started, and Oliver started too, though from a very different cause, for he hoped that the dispute might really end in his being taken back. "Come, hand it over, will you?" said Sykes. "This is hardly fair, Bill, hardly fair. Nancy?" inquired Fagin. "Fair or not fair," retorted Sykes, "hand it over, I tell you. Do you think Nancy and me have got nothing else to do with our precious time but to spend it scouring after and kidnapping every young boy as gets grabbed through you? Give it here, you avaricious old skeleton, give it here." With this gentle remonstrance, Mr. Sykes plucked the note from between Fagin's finger and thumb, and looking the old man coolly in the face, folded up small and tied it in his neckerchief. "That's for our share of the trouble," said Sykes, "and not half enough neither. You may keep the books, if you're fond of reading,
and if not, you can sell 'em." "They're very pretty," said Charlie Bates, who, with sundry grimaces, had been affecting to read one of the volumes in question. "Beautiful writing, isn't it, Oliver?" And at sight of the dismayed look with which Oliver regarded his tormentors, Master Bates, who was blessed with a lively sense of the ludicrous, fell into another ecstasy more boisterous than the first. "They belong to the old gentleman," said Oliver, wringing his hands, "to the good, kind old gentleman who took me into his house and had me nursed when I was very near dying of the fever. Oh, pray send them back. Send him back the books and money. Keep me here all my life long, but pray send them back. He'll think I stole them. The old lady, all of them that were so kind to me, will think I stole them. Oh, do have mercy upon me and send them back." With these words, which were uttered with all the energy of passionate grief, Oliver fell upon his knees at Fagin's feet and beat his hands together in perfect desperation. "The boy's right," remarked Fagin, looking covertly round and knitting his shaggy eyebrows into a hard knot. "You're right, Oliver. You're right. They will think you stole them." Chuckled Fagin, rubbing his hands. "It couldn't have happened better if we had chosen our time." "Of course it couldn't," replied Sykes. "I knowed that directly I see him coming through Clerkenwell with the books under his arm. It's all right enough. They're soft-hearted psalm singers, or they wouldn't have took him in at all. And they'll ask no questions after him, fear they should be obliged to prosecute, and so get him lagged. He's safe enough." Oliver had looked from one to the other while these words were being spoken, as if he were and could scarcely understand what passed. But when Bill Sykes concluded, he jumped suddenly to his feet and tore wildly from the room, uttering shrieks for help that made the bare old house echo to the roof. "Keep back the dog, Bill," cried the angel, springing before the door and closing it as the Jew and his two pupils darted out in pursuit. "Keep back the dog. He'll tear the boy to pieces." "Serve him right," cried Sykes, struggling to disengage himself from the girl's grasp. "Stand off from me, or I'll split your skull against the wall." "I don't care for that, Bill. I don't care for that," screamed the girl, struggling violently with the man. "The child shan't be torn down by the dog unless you kill me first." "Shan't he?" said Sykes, setting his teeth fiercely. "I'll soon do that if you don't keep off." The housebreaker flung the girl from him to the further end of the room, just as Fagin and the two boys returned, dragging Oliver among them. "What's the matter here?" said Fagin, looking round. "The girl's gone mad, I think," replied Sykes savagely. "No, she hasn't," said Nancy, pale and breathless from the scuffle. "No, she hasn't, Fagin. Don't think it." "Then keep quiet, will you?" said Fagin with a threatening look. "No, I won't do that either," replied Nancy, speaking very loud. "Come, what do you think of that?" Mr. Fagin was sufficiently well acquainted with the manners and customs of that particular species of humanity to which Miss Nancy belonged, to feel tolerably certain that it would be rather unsafe to prolong any conversation with her at present. With a view of diverting the attention of the company, he turned to Oliver. "So you wanted to get away, my dear, did you?" said Fagin, taking up a jagged and knotted club which lay in a corner of the fireplace. "Eh?" Oliver made no reply, but he watched Fagin's motions and breathed quickly. "Wanted to get assistance. Called for the police, did you?" sneered Fagin, catching the boy by the arm. "We'll cure you of that, my dear." Fagin inflicted a smart blow on Oliver's shoulders with the club, and was raising it for a second, when the girl, rushing forward, wrestled it from his hand, and flung it into the fire with a force that brought some of the glowing coals whirling out into the room. "I won't stand by and see it done, Fagin," cried the girl. "You've got the boy. And what more would you have? Let him be, or I shall put that mark on some of you that will bring me to the gallows before my time." The girl stamped her foot violently on the floor as she vented this threat, and with her lips compressed and her hands clenched, looked alternately at Fagin and the other robber, her face quite colorless from the passion of rage into which she had gradually worked herself. "Why, Nancy?" said Fagin in a soothing tone. "Why, Nancy?" said Fagin in a soothing tone, after a pause, during which he and Mr. Sikes had stared at one another in a disconcerted manner. You're more clever than ever tonight." "Ha ha! My dear, you are acting beautifully." "Am I?" said the girl, taking care I don't overdo it. "You will be the worse for it, Fagin, if I do, and so I tell you in good time to keep clear of me. There's something about a roused woman, especially if she add to all her other strong passions the fierce impulses of recklessness and despair, which few men like to provoke." Fagin saw that it would be hopeless to effect any further mistake regarding the reality of Miss Nancy's rage, and shrinking involuntarily back a few paces, cast a glance half imploring and half cowardly at Sikes, as if to hint that he was the fittest person to pursue the dialogue. Mr. Sikes, thus mutely appealed to, and possibly feeling his personal pride and influence interested in the immediate reduction of Miss Nancy to reason, gave utterance to about a couple of score of curses and threats, the rapid delivery of which reflected great credit on the fertility of his invention, as they produced no visible effect on the object against whom they were discharged. However, he resorted to more tangible arguments. "What do you mean by this?" said Sikes, backing the inquiry with a very common imprecation concerning the most beautiful of human features, which, if it were heard above only once out of every 50,000 times it is uttered below, would render blindness as common a disorder as measles. "What do you mean by it? Burn my body! Do you know who you are, and what you are?" "Oh, yes, I know all about it," replied the girl, laughing hysterically and shaking her head from side to side with a poor assumption of indifference. Assumption of indifference. With a poor assumption of indifference. "Well, then keep quiet," rejoined Sikes with a growl like that he was accustomed to use when addressing his dog, "or I'll quiet you for a good long time to come." The girl laughed again, even less composedly than before, and, darting a hasty look at Sikes, turned her face aside, and bit her lip till the blood came. "You're a nice one," added Sikes, as he surveyed her with a contemptuous air, "to take up the humane and genteel side. A pretty subject for the child, as you call him, to make a friend of." "God Almighty, help me, I am!" cried the girl passionately. "And I wish I'd been struck dead in the street, or changed places with them we passed so near tonight, before I'd lent a hand in bringing him here. He's a thief, a liar, a devil, all that's bad, from this night forth. Isn't that enough for the old wretch without blows?" Come, Sikes," said Fagin, appealing to him in a remonstratory tone, and motioning towards the boys, who were eagerly attentive to all that passed. "We must have civil words. Civil words, Bill." "Civil words," cried the girl, whose passion was frightful to see. "Civil words, you villain! Yes, you deserve 'em from me. I thieved for you when I was a child not half as old as this," pointing to Oliver. "I have been in the same trade and in the same service for 12 years since. Don't you know it? Speak out. Don't you know it?" "Well, well," replied Fagin with an attempt at pacification, "and if you have, it's your living. "Ah, it is," returned the girl, not speaking, but pouring out the words in one continuous and vehement scream. "It is my living, and the cold, wet, dirty streets are my home, and you're the wretch that drove me to them long ago, and that will keep me there day and night, till I die." "I shall do you a mischief," interposed Fagin, goaded by these reproaches. "A mischief worse than that, if you say much more." The girl said nothing more, but tearing her hair and dress in a transport of frenzy, made such a rush at Fagin as would probably have left signal marks of her revenge upon him, had not her wrists been seized by Ceyx at the right moment. Upon which she made a few ineffectual struggles and fainted. "She's all right now," said Ceyx, laying her down in a corner. "She's uncommon strong in the arms when she's up in this way." Fagin wiped his forehead and smiled, as if it were a relief to have the disturbance over, but neither he nor Ceyx nor the dog nor the boys seemed to consider it in any other light than a common occurrence incidental to business. "It's the worst of having to do with women," said Fagin, replacing the club, "but they're clever, and we can't get on in our line without 'em. Charlie, show Oliver to bed." "I suppose he'd better not wear his best clothes tomorrow, Fagin, had he?" inquired Charlie Bates. One more time. "I suppose he'd better not wear his best clothes tomorrow, Fagin, had he?" inquired Charlie Bates. "Certainly not," replied Fagin, reciprocating the grin with which Charlie put the question. Master Bates, apparently much delighted with his commission, took the cleft stick and led Oliver into an adjacent kitchen, when there were two or three of the beds on which he had slept before, and here, with many uncontrollable bursts of laughter, he produced the identical old suit of clothes which Oliver had so much blessed himself upon leaving off to Mr. Brownlow, and the accidental display of which to Fagin by the angel who purchased them had been the very first clue received of his whereabout. "Pull off the smart ones," said Charlie, "and I'll give 'em to Fagin to take care of. What fun it is!" Poor Oliver unwillingly complied, and Master Bates, rolling up the new clothes under his arm, departed from the room, leaving Oliver in the dark and locking the door behind him. The noise of Charlie's laughter and the voice of Miss Betsy, who had opportunely arrived to throw water over her friend and perform other feminine offices for the promotion of her recovery, might have kept many people awake under more happy circumstances than those in which Oliver was placed. But he was sick and weary, and soon fell sound asleep.